Well, we're an hour into the U.S. trading session. Let's get a check on the latest market moves. Guy, we are seeing a little bit of risk-on behavior here when it comes to the S&P 500, the NASDAQ 100 as well. You are seeing some of those early gains getting paired. We started in the pre-market with that tech outperformance. You are not seeing that continue as the session goes on. You are, however, seeing a bid for the Bloomberg dollar. And remember, that correlation still exists. As you see that bump for the dollar, you do tend to see a little bit of that steam getting pulled out from stocks. So I wonder if that dynamic is still in play. The one that's really caught my eye here is the 10-year break-even. As we have the bond markets pricing in higher inflation, pricing in more hawkish commentary from the FOMC, you do have the 10-year break-even hitting a record intraday high. We're going to keep an eye on that and see if those gains stick or if they continue to rise. That's going to be really significant. Let's talk, though, about the volatility picture, not just when it comes to the United States, but relative to how it looks around the world, especially when it comes to Europe, because we know Europe has far more exposure to what's going on in Ukraine, specifically when it comes to those gas flows. We're going to get a price check for you in a second. But take a look at this. All the way over here in this corner, the blue line here is that European volatility, and you are seeing it actually bump up, tick higher relative to U.S. volatility when it comes to the stock market. So that's going to be something we want to keep our eye on. Do we start to see that regional divergence really widen, especially when it comes to the volatility picture? Let's talk about Russian assets, though, because that really is the story of the day. The Russian stock market opening today, briefly for 4 hours, you did see a bounce back after a month-long closure. The dollar stronger against the ruble. We're keeping an eye on that 98 price. A little bit of a bid into 10-year bonds. The yield's lower, but here's where all the action's happening. It's in those natural gas futures. Just a couple of minutes ago, this was green, and this was green by a lot. You are now seeing some of those gains paired as well. So once again, Guy really speaks to the volatility across assets, specifically when it comes to Europe.
European volatility versus US volatility is going to be really important because presumably that's going to affect the ability of managers to run risks. You get the tap on the shoulder if you're in Europe a little bit quicker. Maybe you get the tap on the shoulder if you're over in the United States. Some headlines coming through. Chuck Schumer saying a deal has been reached to move forward on the Russian trade bill. We'll continue to monitor the headlines there, but let's carry on focusing on the relationship between the United States, between the West and Russia. We've got this gathering of Western allies in Brussels right now. The president is there. Let's get a view on what we should expect from this. Anthony Gardner, former US ambassador to the European Union, joining us now to give us his perspective. Ambassador, we heard earlier on from the president, and we've been hearing it for days now from a series of US voices, warning that there is a serious risk that we see either tactical nuclear weapons or chemical weapons being used by the Russians in Europe, in Ukraine. If that were to take place, can you walk me through the ramifications and the implications for the response that we're going to get from the West and the long-term implications for the relationship with Russia?
Well, obviously, that would be a very significant event. And remember, we've been there before in the sense of usage of chemical weapons in Syria. And remember that President Obama drew a line in the sand and then didn't respect that red line when it was crossed. And I think the decision makers will be remembering that at the top of their mind. So the first thing is apparently we are providing equipment to those on the ground to help prepare them for that horrible eventuality. We've been very clear on both sides of the Atlantic that we're not sending boots on the ground, but there are a lot of things that we could presumably do should that terrible eventuality occur, from significantly expanding the sanctions that have already been put in place. There are many things from cutting off more financial institutions from SWIFT, by imposing import bans, by expanding the sanctions against Russian state-owned companies, and even imposing secondary sanctions to make them even more effective. So I would presume that there are some financial economic steps that would be and should be taken into account.
Ambassador Creedy in New York, I'm curious about simply making up for some of these issues that Europe is dealing with, specifically when it comes to commodities. We know the gas prices, of course, are skyrocketing. I'm curious about the gap that the United States can really make up there. Do you think that that is going to be part of the conversation or part of the future conversation in terms of the U.S. helping Europe out?
I'm not an expert on this topic. It was discussed in 2014, which I lived through very personally after the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, is the extent to which the United States could increase significantly exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe. And at that time, the answer was little and not right away, because those molecules, so to speak, that gas would go to where the prices were highest. But nonetheless, there were some countries that definitely were keen buyers of LNG, including Lithuania, I believe, and Poland. I would assume that some of that gap would be made up. But again, what I'm hearing is that it's not a huge amount. It's not a silver bullet, and it will take time. The key thing I wanted to say here is, a lot of lessons from 2014, 2015. One of them in Europe is that some steps were done to ensure that gas flowed more freely, not only west to east, but east to west, north, south, et cetera. But also, there's a huge steps that still need to be taken to make the EU a true energy union. And in terms of infrastructure projects, very little has been done to ensure that Europe can bring in non-Russian sources of gas. A lot was talked about, but very little bit was done. We need to put money behind these projects to ensure that they occur.
Do you think we should place ourselves in a situation, Ambassador, where the US says, we will only sell to you? We're not going to sell to Asia. We're not going to sell to China. We're going to sell to Europe.
Well, my understanding is those are commercial decisions. It would be very hard, I think, for the U.S. government or the European government to say to commercial enterprises, you can only sell to a particular place in the world, let's say Europe, when typically those companies want to sell where the prices are most advantageous. So I think that would be pretty tricky. But again, that may not even be necessary. There are lots of things that are being discussed, as I understand, today and over the next few days in Europe to ensure that we don't see a repetition, for example, what happened in COVID, with lots of separate EU member states rushing off and trying to strike separate deals on their own. That would be terrible. I think the EU now needs to work at 27 and perhaps even more broadly to say, we're going to negotiate together to get the best, the best price and the best terms. So that's one of the things that can be done.
Okay, Ambassador, just picking up on that point, Bloomberg wrote an editorial a little earlier on today suggesting that maybe now is the time for the US and the EU to strike a broader trade deal to allow a more integrated economy, more integrated economies to flourish. Would you agree with that? Is now the time actually to make that point, to do that deal and cement some of the opportunity that may come out of this?
Absolutely, and I lived through this, again, in a very personal way that took up a large chunk of my time in 2014, 15, 16. We tried, we failed, unfortunately, to strike a transatlantic trade investment partnership agreement. It was probably too broad and too ambitious, but there are things within that agreement, and by the way, there was an energy chapter in that agreement that I would hope that we should resuscitate. Now, there are no signs of that occurring right away, unfortunately, but there are things that I think are politically possible, well short of a full free trade agreement that we really should be doing. And by the way, this is not just an economic agreement. It's a very important agreement because of the political symbolism of it, that the transatlantic space, so to speak, is together, not only in energy, but also, by the way, on regulation and on standards, which is another big area where we need to be very clear-minded about what the Chinese are seeking to do, and by the way, very effectively in setting the standards for cutting-edge technologies of the future.
I'm very glad you mentioned China, Ambassador, because that was my next question here. There are a lot of countries around the world who haven't taken as hard of a line as the EU or the United States has against Russia. India, for example, China is another, several in the Middle East. I'm curious about the Western response to those countries. What do you think we'll hear from them when it comes to that?
Well, those responses are evolving day by day and hour by hour, and of course each country is different. But there's a lot of history here. Every country from Saudi Arabia and India and the Gulf are taking nuanced positions for reasons that go back many years. But as this war continues, and as we're seeing more and more evidence of what Russian troops are doing in Ukraine, I think it's going to be more difficult to take a nuanced position. So I would suspect to see some change.
Ambassador, do you think that this conflict is re-establishing NATO as the preeminent piece of security architecture that exists in Europe? Or do you think actually this is or should be the catalyst for the EU finally to step up and secure within the EU and within the EU architecture its own security, allowing the US maybe to focus on China a little bit more? How do you think security architecture should develop from here? Do you think NATO should be in the driver's seat, or do you think the EU should be in the driver's seat?
It's not either or. It's both, in my view. I think NATO clearly is the key pillar of transatlantic defense. It is far from brain dead. It's quite clear now, but it was called brain dead by French President Macron just a few years ago. It's now rediscovered its purpose, and now we see many countries, not just Germany, by the way, stepping up and saying they're going to meet the necessary thresholds for spending as a percentage of GDP. And not just spending, by the way, it's spending wisely on on kit, on equipment that's relevant for defense. But the EU does have a role to play. And when I was at the post in Brussels, I said repeatedly, and it was the position of the Obama administration, that an EU military and security architecture is very much compatible with NATO. Often they have very different missions, very different aspirations, and as long as the EU aspirations continue along a line that doesn't seek to duplicate or undermine NATO's mission, then we should be fine. In fact, the EU already has some significant defense military missions, mostly in Africa, but also in the Balkans, and those are typically in areas where NATO doesn't want to be involved or can't be involved. So right now, I would say they're complementary.
Ambassador, one last question for you. Let's talk about timeline here. In your expertise, what do you see, how do you see this unraveling? Months, years? Our question of the day actually asks, is the war in Ukraine a long-term risk? Can you put some numbers on simply how long we can expect this conflict to continue?
Impossible question to answer, unfortunately. No one knows the answer to that. Clearly, the Russians have not achieved what they sought out to achieve. It's taken much longer. They seem to be bogged down. I say seem. One has to be very cautious here because this is far from over, it seems to me. And Putin has shown repeatedly that he is a poker player. He's not a chess player. He doubles down and he trebles down, often when he's in a tough spot. I hope this doesn't emerge as a frozen conflict. That's one of the scenarios that's possible. Whereby it's ground down, and the Russians will take their winnings, so to speak, and play for more later on. Or it could be that, as I said, he doubles down and uses more long-range artillery and other hypersonic missiles, which has already happened, and God forbid, worse weapons to achieve their aims, which they failed to do. So there are a lot of scenarios here. I personally am somewhat skeptical right now that Putin's frame of mind is such that he wants to strike an agreement. There's no real sign of that happening yet. I hope I'm wrong.
Well, Anthony Gardner, former U.S. ambassador to the EU, thank you so much for joining us, for your insight, as always. We do have some breaking news here, folks. We are seeing a redhead across the terminal. Morgan Stanley's Blanchard to replace Passy in the syndicate role. This is going to be significant as you start to see some of the shakeups happen at those top banks. Morgan Stanley at the top of it. We'll, of course, give you more headlines as we get them. Coming up next, more on the Biden news conference. This is Bloomberg.
Let's check in on the Bloomberg First Word News. I'm Ritika Gupta. Kim Jong-un has finally abandoned a testing freeze on intercontinental ballistic missiles. North Korea launched its first ICBM in more than 4 years. It went higher and farther than its last test back in 2017. South Korea says the test violated UN resolutions and Kim's promise to hold off on such launches. A change at the top of Norway's central bank. The interim governor of Norges has been offered a 6-year term as its permanent chief.
Notified the Ministry of Finance that I will accept an offer of appointment as governor of Norges Bank, yes.
Jens Stoltenberg resigned as governor of Norges Bank before he even started in the role. Stoltenberg will now stay in his current position as Secretary General of NATO. And it's the first alliance of its kind in the US. Uber will list New York City yellow taxis on its apps. It's an effort to ease a driver shortage. The pressures on fares. Taxis will be offered to Uber customers at the same price as an UberX for the same ride. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg Pretty.
Ritika, thank you so much. Well, for more on Uber's New York City expansion, we welcome Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Ed, talk to us a little bit about the competitive landscape here. Give us the lay of the land now that Uber is kind of partnering with the New York City taxis.
Well, Ritika kind of outlined the mechanics, right, which is on the Uber app, you can get a classic New York yellow taxi. So immediately that, addresses the supply issue. There are a shortage of drivers in key markets. That's number one. But the bigger picture here is that it should give Uber a competitive advantage over Lyft. That's kind of the quick reaction from Wall Street, because if you hold the supply of drivers, I know personally I've been very frustrated in the mornings here in San Francisco that there aren't a driver available on either platform. But New York is only one market, right? It's the biggest US city market, but Uber offers 6 billion rides a year. So it's a single percentage or single-digit percentage of their overall market. And I think that the excitement from our colleagues at Bloomberg Intelligence, for example, is that you could see Uber replicate this model in cities, not just in North America, but around the world.
Ed, let's switch to what else you've been up to, and that is, speaking of Rivian, Claire McDonough, I'm going to get this name wrong, Claire McDonough,
That's right.
who is the CFO. Did I get it right? Well, I'm glad to hear that. My Scottish ancestry may be failing me there. But nevertheless, you've been speaking to her. She's a legend of Wall Street. That's where she grew up. That's where she cut her teeth. Now she's at Rivian. The IPO was a big success, but the company is now focused on engineering. So what is her view of the engineering challenge that Rivian now needs to deliver on?
Yes, so she's been in the job for about 14 months, and she's a first-time CFO, right? They hired her straight from JP Morgan, where she was on the retail and consumer investment banking team. She was a big part of the team at JP Morgan that took Peloton public, for example. So what she lacks is operational experience. And you'll remember in November of last year, this massive IPO, the 6th biggest in US history. They raised almost $14 billion. But since then, the share price has been under a lot of pressure as they've kind of had hiccups, right, operationally. They did a U-turn on prices. The ramp hasn't been as fast as they thought. And they have this super charismatic CEO in Scarin. So I really wanted to look at the CFO because, as we know, they can have such a key role operationally and decisively in making decisions on how to allocate capital.
Well, talk to us a little bit about the other side of the equation, instead of allocating capital, raising prices. What does the perhaps future look like when it comes to that?
Yeah, so look, a lot of sources within and outside the company tell me that that was a big part of why they hired her, right? She knows Wall Street. She speaks the language of Wall Street. And clearly, the IPO was proof of that. They were able to raise such a great amount of money, but also from such a sort of stellar list of institutional investors, many of which bought blocks of $5 billion worth of shares. But they also talk about her broader skill sets. She does lack operational experience, but Rivian has a cash pile now more than $18 billion. Analysts forecast they'll burn most of that over the next 2 years, raising the prospect of having to raise money. And I think the consensus is she'll do that capably.
But in terms of the cash burn, how is she going to manage that process? As you say, first-time CFO. Presumably she is going to be controlling the spigot in terms of how that cash flow works. That cash burn works. What do you get for her in terms of the priorities and the pacing of spending money in terms of the development and the ramp?
Yeah, the key quote from her is that she feels like she and Rivian are in the driver's seat, right? They do have a lot of cash. She wants to be disciplined in how that's allocated. And a big part of that, in reporting this out is the relationship between CFO and CEO. Sources tell me a big reason why they hired Claire McDonough is that she has confidence. She's not afraid to speak up. For example, in the most recent earnings call, RJ Scaringe, the CEO, was trying to outline the production roadmap. He finished his sentence, and analysts asked a follow-up question, and she interjected and said, guys, I'm just going to add a little bit more color here on the production ramp. It's things like that, having the confidence to sometimes be a dissenting voice, but also draw on your experience of what Wall Street wants to hear in how you communicate the plan. And what I get a sense of from the people I talk to is that Claire McDonough is extremely capable, but also not afraid to speak up when she needs to.
Sounds like quite the combination. Ed, great work. Really appreciated the read earlier on today. Thank you very much indeed. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow joining us from San Francisco. This is Bloomberg. So for basically the last month, we have been showing a map of European equity markets. And on that equity market map, you have been able to see Russian equities bright green. It's historical data. Today we get fresh data. Today the market reopens in limited form. We are seeing the central bank obviously a factor into the mix here. The authorities are supporting this Russian market, and it's limited in terms of what is actually happening on that market. It's effectively now for domestic purposes. But the MOEX up by 4.37% today. Take that price and do with what you will, because to be honest, it's a real struggle to figure out exactly what the real value is here. The Russian ruble up by nearly 2% today. The Russian 10-year bond trading at 13.78. Remember, interest rates are at 20%. European gas futures currently at 2.56% lower, i.e. we're coming down on price, but still 114, still very elevated. The thing that I can't figure out, and I don't think anybody can figure out right now, is how long-term you price Russian assets. Do you have to effectively mark everything to zero? How useful is that price there on the MOEX?
Yeah, and how much of that is the currency impact, right? Because since the market was closed for about a month, the ruble has weakened 16%. That, of course, is going to play a role as well.
Yep, and we're going to see exactly which way the ruble goes, and I think the gas story is going to be front and center in that. The Russians would now like to see payment for gas in rubles, effectively asking Europe to support its currency. We'll discuss that in the next hour. The president of Latvia is going to be joining Bloomberg Television. Looking forward to that conversation. This is Bloomberg. Thursday the 24th. Stocks are down, bonds are down. But the focus today, geopolitics. The next hour of Bloomberg Markets starts right now.
From the financial centers of the world, this is Bloomberg Markets with Alex Steele and Guy Johnson.
The price action in Europe looks like this. European stocks are low. We're down by 0.2%. Gas prices are down by 1.5%. And the German 10-year is higher, i.e. bond prices are down. Equities and bonds both moving down today. Kriti, what are you seeing on your side of the pond?
Well, if it's risk off in Europe, it's actually a little bit more risk on in the U.S. You do see a bid going into the S&P 500 here. You're also seeing the bond market busy in terms of pricing in inflation expectations. Take a look at this. The 10-year break-even hitting a record intraday high today. That is going to be crucial as we talk about what the ramifications are. The USD against ruble, you are seeing a little bit of strength go into the dollar. We're going to keep our eye on this as we start to talk about the payments system that Russia wants to impose when it comes to paying for those commodities. And speaking of commodities, we have to look at the Bloomberg Commodity Index. If we're pricing inflation, you are seeing oil a little bit lower today. Take a look at this basket of commodities. It is higher and continues to push higher. And that's really going to be crucial when it comes to what the read-through is, not just for the economy, but for all these other assets we just walked through.
Absolutely. Let's turn back, though, to the focus of the session, geopolitics. President Biden in Brussels, where he's trying to persuade allies to ramp up pressure on Russia as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, there's growing concern about Russia's next military moves. We're joined now by Maria Tadeo. She joins us from the European Council building in Brussels. Anne-Marie Jourdan is at NATO headquarters just up the road. And Aggie Cantrill is on the border between Ukraine and Poland. Let's start with Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo at the Council building. Maria, when the meeting starts, and I'd like your kind of sense of the timing on this, when can we expect this council meeting to begin with the president? What can we expect from it? What do you think the concrete steps that are going to be taken today are likely to be?
Well, Guy, in fact, I believe now the area around this is on lockdown, which means that, of course, European leaders are on their way in. But, of course, the U.S. president is still in a G7 meeting, and we're waiting for Emmanuel Macron to do a press conference. So if you ask me, this is running probably with a 2-hour delay before we get anything that's significant or news lines that break from this meeting. Now, this is going to be a meeting by nature very different to that of NATO. It will be of political substance, and we know a lot of the conversation will feature energy, what to do with that. Remember, the Europeans are now threatened by Vladimir Putin. If you don't pay me in rubles, then I may cut off supplies into the European Union. That is going to be a big part of this conversation. And then the second one is about Ukraine. And Guy, we know now that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will be joining in a video conference. And this is a political discussion. This is about the future of Ukraine. We know that this country's had a major reality check. It knows that it's not going to join NATO, but it continues to repeat in a peace deal, we want to get international security guarantees that involve the United States and the European Union. They also double down, okay, if we don't join NATO, then we want to join the European Union. And this is a hot potato for the European Union. There's some countries that will tell you after this, a brutal war, they deserve to be the 20th member of the Union. Others will tell you, well, the reality is this is a country at war. It has been destroyed by war. And the process that usually takes to enter the European Union, we simply cannot do it in real terms.
Maria, let's zero in on those energy kind of aspect of the conversation right now. What are the odds that that request to start to pay in rubles actually comes to fruition? What is the take on the ground there?
Well, look, this took a lot of people by surprise yesterday. Vladimir Putin saying, of course, we are going to continue to deliver gas into the European Union. We're going to keep the volume and the pricing the same. But, of course, these are countries that are not being economically friendly when it comes to the Russian Federation. He's referring, of course, to the EU 27. Now, I had a number of officials today suggesting there is no appetite from the European Union to pay in rubles. What they say is the contracts right now are very clear. You pay in hard currency and you pay in euros. If you don't accept that, that, well, it's Russia that's in breach of contract. And then it also say at one point, Vladimir Putin is going to have to make a decision. If you don't accept the payments made in euros, then what do? Do you not take the money which you need, or do you cut the flows from Gazprom into the European Union? But at that point, this is going to hurt both. The European Union, clearly, they don't get the gas they need, but at the same time, Russia loses out its money-making machine, that is Gazprom. And I would just point to one thing. Up until now, even in the run-up to the invasion, Gazprom continued to fulfill their contractual obligations. They always played on the line, but when you looked at the fine print, they always complied with the terms. So in many ways, the mood here in the European Union is just wait and see whether or not Vladimir Putin means business when he says, I'm only taking ruble payments.
Well, Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo, thank you so much for your reporting and for your time. About an hour ago, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby told Anne-Marie Hordern that the U.S. has not eliminated the possibility of temporarily sending more troops to Eastern Europe. Anne-Marie joins us now from the NATO headquarters. Anne-Marie, walk us a little bit through what's going on at NATO and specifically how they're planning to address some of those nuclear worries.
Well, they're definitely doubling down on the eastern flank, sending more troops. And my question to John Kirby, the Pentagon press secretary, is this something that could be the future of American troops long term? And he really said they just don't know yet, because right now is clearly a new security threat in Europe that they haven't faced since the end of World War II. So there's a big question mark on how much the United States is going to continue that troop deployment, especially to the eastern flank of NATO. That was discussed in this building behind me. Now, of course, we have the G7 taking place, and President Biden is in that meeting. What we are expecting is a sharp warning from the G7 to President Putin and the Kremlin against using chemical warfare. This is biological nuclear weapons that could potentially, they worry, could be used in a false flag operation into Ukraine. Just quickly, Press Secretary John Kirby said to me there would be severe consequences, but right now that's all we know. These words, severe consequences, still need to know what that action will look like.
Yep, the Obama administration said there will be severe consequences for the use of chemical weapons in Syria, never really followed up on them. Is that the challenge that the administration now faces? How to respond? When do you think we might start to get some flesh on the bones on that? What kind of a response would we get were that to happen? Because I'm hearing the message loud and clear, Anne-Marie. The Russians are getting ready to do this. What we're not getting is how would the West respond?
I think that's what part of the deliberations are today. They just don't know yet what that response would exactly mean. They're very careful not to draw a red line. Guy, that's incredible analysis. As you remember back that there was a red line drawn in Syria and then it wasn't acted upon. And we should know Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons when President Vladimir Putin was his main ally, giving a lot of defense cover in Syria. So this is something that many think that is a potential that President Putin could actually revert to, especially as this war drags on. And what we've seen on the ground is it's not the swift war the Kremlin thought it would be. But at the moment, we just hear very sharp rhetoric of severe consequences. We just don't know yet what that will be. What we can say, though, is that John Kirby, the press secretary for the Pentagon, said that he feels that right now NATO has more united than he's seen his entire career. And he was in the Navy and, of course, has worked at the Pentagon. And you are getting that messages from leaders here at NATO. It does seem like there is an ironclad front in terms of also defending NATO territory and that Article 5.
Yeah, but hard to talk about deterrence when you don't make it very clear what the ultimate deterrence is. With the Russians talking about escalating to de-escalate, we find ourselves in an interesting position. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern, thank you very much indeed. Stay tuned, of course, later. We'll get more information on this subject. We are going to be speaking to the president of Latvia. We think that interview is going to take place this hour. Anne-Marie, back on the network for that interview. Let's talk about the situation now on the ground. Bloomberg's Aggie Cantrell joining us from the border between Ukraine and Poland. Aggie, talk to us about military developments. Talk to us about why potentially we may now find ourselves in the situation where the Russians could be using chemical or nuclear weapons because of how bogged down they are in the offensives that they've been pushing forward with so far.
Yes, Guy, it's exactly as Anne-Marie pointed out, that this was expected to be something that would happen swiftly, that the Kremlin would be able to enter Ukraine and manage to get their war aims done as quickly as possible. That has not happened. We hear these latest NATO estimates, between 7,000 and 15,000 Russian troops are estimated to have been killed in the fighting. And for context, that upper limit of that estimate, 15,000 troops, is how many are believed to have died in the Soviet campaign against Afghanistan that lasted 10 years. So this is a key concern, that potentially with these heavy losses, the Russians could become more desperate. And we're already seeing them focusing their attentions on the eastern parts of the country, in Lugansk and Donetsk, and we're seeing the destruction of cities like Mariupol as they're trying to repurpose their efforts, as they're seeing that they're still not managing to fully encircle the capital of Kiev.
Aggie, talk to us a little bit about the humanitarian crisis, the refugee crisis out there. I believe there were headlines earlier that the United States is now opening their borders more to some of those refugees coming to the States from Ukraine. Talk to us a little bit about the significance of Biden's trip to Poland and what we can really expect from that.
Yes, so as well as the security aspect of Biden's trip, which will of course be very significant, there's also the humanitarian aspect. Poland has taken in over 2 million of the refugees that have crossed the border from Ukraine, and now with this news from the White House that they would be willing to accept 100,000 refugees into the United States from this war, that is obviously very timely for Biden's visit to Poland tomorrow and on Saturday. And so we're expecting Duda, the president of Poland, to not only talk to Biden about the security concerns that his country really feels around this war. They are bordering Ukraine themselves, and they feel those security risks to their own population, but also the humanitarian aspect. Poland has been taking in the majority of these refugees, and they're waiting for other countries to step up.
Bloomberg's Aggie Cantrell, thank you so much for your reporting. And some breaking news. We go from Europe to Mexico. You are seeing the Bank of Mexico here talk about raising their key interest rate 50 basis points to 6.5%. Now, ordinarily, this isn't that significant, just given that 50 basis points was the expectation. But this comes off the heels of slower inflation. So is the Mexican Central Bank actually perhaps targeting inflation that's already looking to ease just a little bit? You are seeing a bump, some strength, I should say, in the Mexican peso against the dollar and against the Brazilian real as well. More coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
In Ukraine rages on.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin.
What is happening is a genocide of Ukrainians.
Putin must fail.
Turn to Bloomberg for up-to-the-minute reporting from around the world.
1.2 million people have crossed into Poland.
The Children's Hospital, the latest target.
Putin has gone all in.
And analysis of what it all means to you.
The corporate exodus continues.
For every dollar the United States could lose, the European Union stands to lose 10.
Keep it tuned to Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Events in Brussels dominating the agenda. President Biden just wrapping up his meeting with European leaders, including the Latvian president. He is now with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. Let's go back to Brussels.
Thanks, Guy. That's right. I'm joined by the Latvian President, Egils Levits, just coming out of that NATO meeting with the President of the United States and the other leaders of NATO. Thank you so much for joining Bloomberg Television.
Well, yeah, thank you.
President Biden is now at this G7 meeting, and there's going to be a draft statement, a warning to President Putin about the use of chemical or biological weapons, which Jens Stoltenberg says will have dire consequences on NATO countries as well. Would you view that as an attack on a NATO ally?
The use of chemical, biological, nuclear weapons is a big threat to Europe, to the whole world, not only to Ukraine, and we should give a adequate response to that. I cannot yet announce this response, but of course it would be a response for Russia. Russia should think twice before Russia will use such weapons.
We keep hearing about, quote, severe consequences.
Yeah.
You won't mention them, but were they discussed? What kind of consequences NATO and the West would impose?
We should not announce these consequences in advance.
But wouldn't that be a deterrent? Wouldn't announcing the consequences potentially deter President Putin from using those type of weapons?
The consequences would be, but we would not announce this in advance, because then, of course, Russia will know and will calculate that.
But you know what the response is?
We will think about, and this calculated ambiguity is a part of our tactic.
Would you consider the use of chemical, biological, nuclear weapons a red line?
Of course, it would change the situation completely, and the answer should be respective.
Is there a potential that this type of escalation from Russia would start to a conversation amongst NATO allies to use military intervention?
Our politics now is to help the Ukraine in every possible way to defend the nation themselves. And we are giving military help, lethal weapons, other military equipment, and of course financial, economic support, humanitarian support. But of course, this is the Ukrainian nation is very highly motivated to defend the country, and we are helping in every possible way to do it.
I want to ask you about what's going on in terms of NATO military presence in the Baltics, in Latvia. I spoke to the press secretary of the Pentagon, John Kirby, and he said he's unsure if this is now a long-term heightened presence. Do you expect that to last?
We have discussed the strengthening of NATO's eastern flank. This is Baltics, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, also Czech Republic, and there is agreement that the eastern flank should be strengthened. Is already done, partially. For example, there is already a decision to double the number of NATO battle groups in this area. We have now 4 battle groups, one in Estonia, one in Latvia, one in Lithuania, then in Poland, and now there would be 4 additional more. And also this
And you think they'll be permanent?
Of course, they are permanent. NATO battle groups are permanent, but of course, the permanent presence of U.S. Forces, this is a different issues, and we are in contact. We should see how to deploy the NATO forces so that the whole NATO eastern flank is more secure, more sure as it is now.
I want to ask you about the sanctions. There's still Russian oil and gas flowing into Europe. At some point, is Europe going to have to cut that off?
Yes. In principle, there is a clear decision we should cut off this.
But this is going to hurt your economy.
Yes, of course. There are certain costs we should pay for our freedom, for our independence, and in shortest possible time we will do it.
I believe last year Latvia took in 90% of their natural gas from Russia, and now President Putin is asking those contracts to be paid in rubles. Is that something Latvia is willing to do?
It is not only for Latvia. This is also for Germany and other buyers of Russian gas. We will see how we will answer. But in general, Europe, also Latvia too, has decided already to cut the energy dependence from Russia as soon as possible.
But if next week you had to pay in rubles to keep the lights on and the houses warm in Latvia, is Latvia willing to do that?
We have enough reserves for the moment.
And if you start to wean yourself off of Russian gas, where else will you find it?
Yes, it is possible to get alternatives. LNG, there are LNG terminals in Europe, and then it is also possible to replace Russian gas.
Are you talking to those types of partners?
Yes.
The cost, though, is going to be incredibly higher. Is there something the government's willing to do to help ease the pain for consumers?
Yes, of course, I can repeat, this is a price for our freedom. And it is better to pay in dollars or in euros, as the Ukrainians are doing with blood.
I want to ask you about your time at the European Court of Justice, because the United States is now saying President Putin is a war criminal. Do you agree, and how do you think this is going to proceed in the legal sense?
International Criminal Court in Hague has already opened investigations in war crimes which committed Russia, and the investigations are now going on already second week. It takes some time, and then of course I assume that it will end with accusation against responsible persons, and I should remind that responsible persons all which belongs to the chain of command, from the first person.
But do you agree that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal?
To the last executor of this commands. So from a legal point of view, it would be determined by the International Criminal Court. But of course, on the first sight, there are no doubts that there are war crimes which Russia has already committed in Ukraine.
Egils Levits, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Guy, that was the Latvian President Egils Levits, and pretty frank, he thinks Russian oil and gas should be sanctioned.
Yep. Is that a realistic prospect? Anne-Marie, thank you very much indeed. Anne-Marie Hordern, our Washington correspondent, joining us from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Let's try and answer that question. Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Cambridge, joining us now on set. How realistic is it a prospect, is the prospect of Europe actually being able to turn the taps off at this point? The American president is here. He's promising cargoes of LNG. But realistically, with the infrastructure that we have currently, is that going to do enough?
I think absolutely not. I mean, if you take Germany's case, Germany doesn't have the capacity to import liquid natural gas and would have to be imported to the Netherlands, with ports there, and then moved on to Germany. This is not something that can be a technological fix done very quickly. And then there's the second question of like what the effect on prices are, because European countries who do import liquid natural gas from the United States are already in pretty fierce competition with Asian countries, and China's demand for gas has gone up a lot in the last 18 months or so. So the corollary of this would be a big rise in gas prices, and we don't yet really know whether a big rise in gas prices has got the capacity to send Western economies into recession, because we haven't had a gas-driven recession before, gas price-driven recession. But it's a severe possibility, even if we leave aside the oil price question.
Helen, in your book, you talk about the 1956 Suez Crisis and how Europe kind of had to navigate that in terms of finding its supplies. I'm curious, on the back of the war in Ukraine, does this rebalance perhaps some of the supply dynamics? You just said the United States would be, or Europe would be in competition with Asia in terms of getting American exports. But talk to us about the possibility or the odds of the U.S. ramping up exports and the European dependence going from Russia to the United States instead.
Yeah, I think that this depends on whether we're talking about oil or gas. I mean, I think that what's true at the moment is that the shale oil producers in the United States have shown no willingness to respond to the present situation by increasing output. Their concern is with capital discipline. That's been true since last year. I think where shale gas is concerned, the United States has a clearer export capacity, and in the way which Biden's just been talking about, is willing to use it. But we must bear in mind, as I've already said, that we're talking about demand for gas that has been growing because of Asian demand really quite considerably over the last 18 months or so. In some sense, I think we could say that the United States is trying to act like it didn't do in Suez, over Suez, which is to act as emergency energy provider for Western Europe. But the world isn't the way it was in the 1950s, not least because Asia matters a lot more where energy markets are concerned than it did then. I mean, it matters fantastically more than it did then.
Helen, stick around. We have to take a short break. We were slightly interrupted, obviously, by the interview from NATO headquarters. I'd like to come back and talk more about how we're redrawing the map in Europe from a security point of view. We'll do that next. Cambridge University professor Helen Thompson staying with us. Let me just give you a quick update on where we are in terms of asset prices right now. The Nasdaq continuing to climb over the last half hour. We're now up by 0.9%. The S&P also up by 0.9%. Europe now moving into the green as well. Half an hour ago we were negative pretty much across the board. The FTSE 100 now up by 0.3%. European equity markets climbing as well, but we are seeing pressure on bonds. As I say, when we come back, we'll refocus on what is happening in the security architecture realm. Are we basically pivoting back from the EU to NATO? We'll talk about that next. This is Bloomberg. Half past the hour, welcome back. We're still with Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Cambridge. Let's pick back up on that conversation. She is, of course, the author of the book Disorder, Hard Times in the 21st Century. Let's talk about the order by which we are securing our future. The idea over the last few years, certainly coming out of Europe, certainly coming out of the Elysee Palace, has been that the European Union should be the principal bedrock on which European security is founded. Shifting away from NATO, the president famously called NATO brain dead. Has the war in Ukraine now completely reversed that? Has the war in Ukraine basically put to bed the idea that the European Union should be the primary security architecture for Europe?
I think if you look at it from Washington's point of view, it might have demonstrated the opposite in that Washington wants to focus on China and it would like the Europeans ultimately to take care of their own security. But if you look at it from the point of view of Macron's ambitions, I would say that Macron's ambitions have been absolutely shattered by this crisis. You go back to the speeches that Macron was making in 2019, at that time when he said that NATO was brain dead. He thought that the future of the European project, European sovereignty in his terms, depended on détente with Russia. He was very explicit about that. He drew a certain civilizational line that connected Russia to Europe and said if Europe didn't want to disappear between Sino-American rivalry, it had to reset relations with Russia. Well, that view can't survive this crisis. And in one sense, his biggest opponent, if you like, in the European Union was the Polish government, who said the exact opposite. Who said we've got to get much more serious about Russian geopolitical power, and that view's been vindicated. But it's very difficult to see, I think, how Poland leads the European Union. So in Europe itself, I think that this puts the emphasis very much back onto NATO, and that's the direction of travel that the German government, I think, is already going in.
Helen, speaking of the emphasis on NATO, what does this mean for countries like Turkey, countries like Finland or Sweden that might have a renewed kind of desire to re-enter NATO? What's your thought on that?
I think that Turkey is a really interesting case here because the other country that Macron was, or the country that Macron was really talking about when he said that NATO was brain dead, was Turkey. Macron came pretty close to saying in 2019 that he didn't think that Turkey should be in NATO. And yet Turkey's shown its utter indispensability for NATO in dealing with the present crisis because it's been able to stop Russian warships, except those returning to bases in the Black Sea, entering the Black Sea. Turkey's also been providing very effective military drones to Ukraine. So the idea that Turkey can be dispensed with in NATO, I think, is also another illusion that's shattered during this crisis.
Energy has always been important to geopolitics and in some ways foundational in terms of the way that lines are drawn. Is that the way the world is now going to break up? Are we now going to basically break up along the lines of Europe, the West? We have energy policy within that group. We have with the United States, and then we have Russia, China, India on the other side. Is that now the direction of travel? Is that how globalization is going to fragment?
In a way, yes. I think the complicated question is the Middle East. I think at the moment that we've seen that the Saudis don't really want to break with the Russians. They're not going to give up on OPEC Plus because of this war. But the Russians and the Saudis are also in competition for Asian markets. It's not a necessarily steady and tension-free relationship between the second and third largest oil producers in the world. I would say that we're going to see energy spheres of influence, but at the same time there are supply-side issues, particularly on oil, I would say, and that means that as much as anything we're going to see a competition that it won't necessarily be possible, at least at present prices, for the United States to take care of all the Western Hemisphere, should we say, to take care of all of Western energy needs.
As technology plays its hand and we maybe accelerate the process towards some of these more sustainable fuels. Cambridge University Professor Helen Thompson, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to try and draw now a link between NATO and monetary policy. Jens Stoltenberg has withdrawn from his role, which he was expected to take later this year, as the governor of the Norges Bank, the central bank of Norway. He has now announced that he's going to stay in his current job as the Secretary of NATO, Secretary General of NATO. So I spoke with who was then the interim governor of the Norges Bank a little bit earlier, Ida Wolden Barhe. She is now becoming the first permanent member for the next 6 years of the central bank. Listen to our conversation.
I can confirm that I have notified the Ministry of Finance that I will accept an offer of appointment as governor of Norges Bank, yes.
And what do you think that role is going to entail? What do you think that your job over the next few years is going to be?
Norges Bank has an important mission, both as a central bank and as a manager of the government pension fund Global. And my job will be to make sure that we fulfill that mission as best as we can.
In terms of the degree of certainty that you are going to have as you set policy over the next few months and years, how much uncertainty is there at the moment? The situation in Ukraine is obviously complicating the situation significantly. As you set policy, what is your degree of certainty at the moment?
Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused massive destruction and human suffering, and it has also heightened uncertainty about the global economic outlook, and therefore also about the outlook for the Norwegian economy.
And in terms of what you see that Norwegian economy doing, is it in a position now where you need to slow it down significantly? We are starting to see second round effects bubbling up around the global economy, particularly in Europe now and in the United States. How hard are you going to have to step on the brake, do you think?
So we have announced today that we are raising the policy rate from 0.5 to 0.75%. We also published a new interest rate forecast, which indicates that the policy rate will be raised gradually to about 2.5% at the end of 2023. With that interest rate forecast, we expect inflation to be close to the inflation target in the medium term. Moreover, we expect unemployment to remain low and capacity utilization to remain above a normal level in the years to come.
Are you seeing any evidence of second round effects when it comes to inflation at the moment?
We are seeing core inflation picking up, and we expect that rising wage growth and higher imported price growth will push up core inflation going forward.
And in terms of your ability to deliver what is now being called a soft landing, how easy is that going to be? How difficult do you think the environment in front of you is going to make delivering such a soft landing for the Norwegian economy?
Now, the outlook that we are seeing is that unemployment will remain low and activity in the Norwegian economy will remain high going forward at the same time as inflation will stabilize around the inflation targets. But obviously there is great uncertainty about the global outlook, which will also impact the Norwegian economy through imported prices, but also export demand. And obviously there is volatility in energy markets and financial markets. That uncertainty and the uncertainty associated with how much raising the policy rate will affect households is what prompts us to move gradually with the policy rate.
Ida Wolden Barhe, the now permanent Norges Bank governor. Pretty.
Yeah, smart interview. Thank you for bringing that to us. Let's turn back to the markets here. Our question of the day asks, is the war in Ukraine a long-term risk? Who better to ask than Peter Shafrick, global macro strategist at RBC Capital Markets. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Well, let's put that question to you. Is Ukraine a long-term risk? Give us a timeline when it comes to how the market should be approaching what's going on in Europe.
Well, I think definitely it's a long-term risk, and if only through the accelerated or likely accelerated response from the central banks that we're now seeing. We know that the central banks, and we just heard it, they were in a more hawkish tilt already anyway, but given the rise in energy prices, given the rise in food prices that we're seeing also as a response of that, we're now seeing an acceleration of that policy. And if I may add, in events of this proportion, there are quite often follow-on effects that are very difficult to see in the near term. Food prices and the consequence thereof, for instance, could be one of them. And as I said, there's probably outcomes that we only find out in a year's time that can be traced back to the war that we're currently seeing, unfortunately. So yes, I do think it will have long-term consequences.
Peter, do you think a soft landing is possible? Do you think a soft landing is possible in Europe? Do you think a soft landing is possible in the United States? The Fed continues to believe that it is. What's your view?
Well, look, I mean, it's always sort of it's always the Goldilocks scenario for central banks. And if we come to a situation where you need to tighten policy, where you need to sort of cool the economy down, everyone aims for the soft landing. Unfortunately, it's very rarely ever delivered. I think the case of the Fed isn't particularly interesting because when you look at sort of what they have proposed in their SEPs and what they said in the press conference is that what they really want to do is they want to cool the excess demand that's currently there, want to bring it down to the equilibrium level without sort of disturbing the labor market, without disturbing the growth rates. I mean, it's, certainly there's a possibility that this can happen, but, there's always an inherent risk with the uncertainties and the time lag involved, and that it doesn't pan out that way.
Peter, let's talk about recession odds here. Of course, we know that is what central banks around the world are trying to avoid. But talk to us a little bit about the odds of a recession in Europe versus the odds of a recession in the United States.
I mean, clearly, sort of the odds over here in Europe, I would argue, are higher. And the reason for that is, A, that the direct as well as the indirect impacts are most likely going to be larger than they are in the U.S. I mean, when you look at sort of the relative increase of gas prices, as an example, when you look at sort of the direct and indirect links with the region involved, I think that's clearly a bigger risk for us over here in Europe. And then when you look at the state of the economy that we've been before, the U.S. is clearly more advanced than we are. They have wage growth already, which we don't have in the euro area, for instance. So I think that the risks are higher. Now, the bigger question for me when we talk about sort of recession is whether it's going to be just a shallow technical recession that sort of maybe sees 1 or 2 quarters of negative growth rates, and then we pick back up, and unemployment can indeed stay relatively low, and employment intentions can stay relatively elevated. And I think there are reasons to believe in that, or whether it's something deeper. So I think that's the probably more pertinent question, to be honest.
Peter, the PMI data out of France today started to show some evidence that second-round effects are beginning to emerge in Europe. If that turns out to be the case and that is replicated elsewhere, is the ECB going to have to accelerate even faster its process of tightening?
So first of all, I think it's almost a given that the PMIs will show more implications, and we've probably just seen the tip of the iceberg here. But when you listen carefully to sort of what the ECB is saying, and also when you sort of hear reports about how the debates within the council are going, it seems to me, whereas over the Draghi years, over the early phase of the Lagarde years, the so-called dovish members, the doves, always had the upper hand, and if push came to shove, they would always outvote or out-argue the hawkish members. And it seems to be that this has turned, and the ECB is concerned about inflation, it's concerned about second-round effects, and I would also say it's probably concerned that it's not adequately able to predict where inflation is going, that it makes mistakes in its own calculations and in its own forecasts, and therefore I think they're trying to get away from this sort of very, very dovish stance that they've been in, and I reckon this is likely going to continue, even if we sort of slow down in growth numbers and if the PMIs are weakening.
Peter, talk to us a little bit about where COVID fits into all of this, because there are still parts of the world that are very much dealing with the virus in ways that perhaps the West is not. Is this something that central banks and even the markets should really be taking as a primary concern at the moment?
I'm not quite sure about the primary concern, because obviously the war in Ukraine sort of, hangs over everything. But it's certainly a concern, and I think you phrased it or framed it quite well, because when you look at sort of our numbers over here, if you look at the numbers in the US, yes, the cases are rising, but we don't have the same kind of pressure on our hospital systems, on our medical systems in general, and therefore I think the risks for the economy are relatively moderate. Now, when you look at sort of the Asian economies in particular, I think it's a quite different situation. We've seen sort of some of the lockdowns in China already, and that can have repercussions for us as well through supply chains, but also obviously through our external sector that is quite heavily dependent on Asia in particular. So I think it's something that should not be underestimated, but I think the big difference compared to prior years is that it's not the primary focus over here in Europe or in the Western economies in general, and that our domestic economies now are much stronger, and therefore we have a much bigger balance to the external sector than we had 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Peter, always great to catch up. Really good to get your insights. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Shafrick of RBC Capital Markets. Thank you very much. This is Bloomberg.